I never expected my life to turn out like this. If you had told me years ago that I would be completely estranged from my mother and sister, I wouldn't have believed you. But sometimes, life forces you to make choices you never thought you'd have to make. Growing up, I always knew I wasn't the favorite. My younger sister, Nancy, was the golden child always adored, always protected. Damon, my younger brother, and I were just there. We existed in the background while Nancy took center stage in our mother's eyes. Our father tried to balance things out, but he was always fighting an uphill battle. Mom had a special kind of blindness when it came to Nancy. She could do no wrong. No matter what she did, how cruel she was, how selfish, Mom always had an excuse, always defended her, always found a way to blame someone else. Usually, that someone else was me or Damon. Nancy knew it too. She wielded that favoritism like a weapon. She was beautiful, confident, and had a sharp tongue that could cut you to pieces, and she enjoyed using it. She had a special talent for finding insecurities and digging her claws into them. I still remember one moment vividly. I was 12 years old, excited about a new outfit I had saved up for months to buy. The second Nancy saw me, she wrinkled her nose and said, "That makes you look even whiter than usual." "Mom?" She just laughed. "Oh, Nancy, don't be silly," she said, as if it was a joke, as if my face hadn't just burned with humiliation. That was the pattern. Nancy would insult. Mom would excuse me. Damon and I would silently take it, knowing nothing would change. But then, everything did change. When Dad passed away, it was like the final thread holding our family together snapped. He had been our only shield, the only one who even tried to mediate. Without him, Mom had no reason to pretend anymore. Damon and I started drifting away from her, and Nancy. It wasn't intentional at first, just fewer calls, fewer visits. Then, slowly, it became a choice. A wall formed between us, one I didn't want to break down. Mom didn't chase after us. Neither did Nancy. And honestly, that was a relief. Damon and I built our own lives. I had a successful career. He worked hard to start his own magazine. We were doing well, happy in our own worlds. But then Damon had an accident, a serious one. He shattered his ankle, and between medical bills and being unable to work, he was struggling. So I stepped in. I covered his medical expenses, his therapy, even hired a nurse to help him recover. To me, it was the obvious thing to do. He was my brother. I loved him. But in doing so, I made a mistake. I underestimated how deep Nancy's entitlement ran. It had been months since I last spoke to Nancy. Then one day, out of nowhere, my phone rang. "Hey, sis," she said, her voice sugar-sweet. That should have been my first warning. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't even mention Damon. She got straight to the point. "I need your help with something important," she said. "I'm buying a penthouse, and I need a little extra to cover the cost." I almost laughed. "Excuse me? I mean, it's not like you can't afford it," she continued, as if I hadn't just expressed pure shock. "You paid for Damon's medical bills. It's only fair you help me too." I was stunned. She wasn't asking for a loan. She wasn't asking for help with something necessary. She wanted a penthouse. "Nancy," I said slowly, "are you seriously asking me for money because you're embarrassed about living with Mom? It's different. I deserve this. You helped Damon because he was injured, because he needed it." Her voice turned sharp. "And I need this. It's not fair for you to choose favorites." "You want fairness?" I snapped. "Where was fairness when we were kids? Where was fairness when Mom spent years making excuses for you while Damon and I had to fend for ourselves?" Silence. Then, her voice turned icy. "So that's how it is." "That's exactly how it is," I said. "Get a job if you want a penthouse." I hung up. She called back. I ignored her, but I should have known she wouldn't stop there. A few hours later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Mom. "I can't believe how selfish you're being," she said, her voice dripping with disappointment. "Nancy is your sister. Family helps each other." "Funny," I said bitterly. "Where was this family loyalty when I was struggling? Where was this support when I had to work my way through college alone?" She ignored me. "You have the money. It's just sitting there. Why wouldn't you use it for your own sister?" "Because she doesn't need it," I shot back. "She just wants luxury, and I'm not her piggy bank." Mom sighed dramatically. "I thought I raised you better than this. If you don't help Nancy, you'll regret it." "I think I'll take my chances." "You know what?" she snapped. Maybe it's best if we don't speak until you realize what's truly important. I wanted to be hurt. I wanted to feel guilty, but all I felt was relief. Fine by me, I said, and I ended the call. Then I blocked both of them. For a while, things were quiet. Damon was recovering well. My life was back to normal. Then I got a call from my uncle, my dad's brother, the man who had taken over the family business after Dad passed. "We need to talk," he said. "It's about your mother." I felt my stomach drop. "What did she do now?" He hesitated. "She's trying to transfer a large part of her company's shares to Nancy. Voting shares." My blood ran cold. Nancy was lazy, entitled, and reckless. She had no business sense whatsoever. If she got control of the company, she would run it straight into the ground. "We need to stop this," he said, "before it's too late." I knew he was right, but I also knew that stopping my mother and Nancy wouldn't be easy. They wouldn't go down without a fight. And for the first time in a long time, I realized I was ready to fight back. I didn't think things could get worse, but I underestimated just how deep my mother and Nancy's entitlement ran. After my firm refusal to fund Nancy's ridiculous penthouse dream, I expected anger, maybe some guilt tripping, but nothing could have prepared me for what followed. Nancy, incapable of taking no for an answer, decided to escalate things. She reached out to every relative she could, twisting the story into something unrecognizable. According to her, I was flaunting my wealth while my poor, struggling baby sister was left homeless and destitute. She painted me as a heartless, greedy monster who only cared about myself. She paid for Damon's medical bills without hesitation, but when it comes to me, she acts like I don't exist. She wailed in a voice memo she conveniently sent to our entire extended family. I'm her sister. Doesn't family mean anything to her? The guilt tripping didn't stop there. My mother, as expected, backed her up, feeding into the narrative that I had turned my back on them. "After everything I sacrificed for you," she said in a tearful voicemail, "this is how you repay me? I raised you, gave you everything, and now you won't even help your own blood?" I wanted to scream. The audacity was overwhelming. My mother had given me nothing. If anything, she had taken from me years of emotional neglect, a lifetime of feeling like I was never enough, and now she wanted to take my hard-earned money too. The messages from relatives started pouring in. Some were subtle, hesitant. "Maybe you should reconsider," an aunt suggested. "It's just a little help, and Nancy is family." Others were outright aggressive. "How can you sleep at night knowing your own sister is struggling?" one cousin demanded. I was furious. Not one of them had ever spoken up for me when Nancy and my mother treated me like an afterthought. Not one of them had ever defended Damon when Nancy humiliated him at family gatherings. But now that Nancy was playing the victim, suddenly everyone had an opinion. I blocked most of the messages, refusing to engage. But then, Damon called me. "I saw what's happening," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "They're trying to turn everyone against you." "I know," I muttered, rubbing my temples. "It's exhausting. You know what's worse?" he continued. "Nancy already has a place. Mom isn't telling anyone, but she's been covering Nancy's rent this whole time. She's not homeless. She just wants an upgrade." I froze. "What?" I heard it from Uncle Mike. "Mom's been paying her rent for over a year. That whole sob story about needing a place to live? Complete lie. She's not struggling. She's just entitled." My grip on the phone tightened. The manipulation was next level. They weren't just trying to guilt me, they were outright deceiving people to make me look like the villain. And I was done playing their game. Instead of responding to the flood of messages, I decided to take control of the situation. If they wanted to spread lies, I would spread the truth. I called a family meeting. It wasn't easy. Some relatives ignored my invitation, having already decided I was the bad guy. Others came purely out of curiosity, eager to see the drama. But those who mattered, my grandparents, some aunts and uncles, and, of course, Damon showed up. I kept my voice calm, even though I was seething inside. "I know you've all heard Nancy's side of the story. Now, it's time you hear mine." I laid out everything. How I had supported Damon because he had a real emergency. How Nancy had never worked a real job in her life, jumping from one hobby to another while relying on my mother's financial support. How she wasn't actually struggling, but rather wanted a luxury penthouse because she felt embarrassed to live in a normal apartment. Then, I dropped the bombshell. Mom has been paying her rent this entire time. Nancy has never been in danger of being homeless. She just wants me to fund her lifestyle. And when I refused, They decided to lie to all of you. Gasps filled the room. My mother's face went pale, her lips tightening into a thin line. Nancy, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly jumped up. "That's not true!" she shrieked. "Mom only helped a little. I am struggling. You just want to make me look bad." "Enough," my grandfather cut in, his usually kind voice laced with disappointment. He turned to my mother. "Is it true? Have you been paying Nancy's rent?" For the first time in her life, my mother looked small, caught, exposed. I was just trying to help my daughter," she stammered. "And yet you demanded your other daughter pay for a luxury apartment?" He countered. "You lied to all of us." Nancy started crying, but for once, no one was buying it. The tide had turned. Relatives who had attacked me earlier now looked uncomfortable. Some murmured apologies. Others just sat in stunned silence. But it didn't matter, I had won. My mother and Nancy left the meeting humiliated. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt relief. But instead, I felt something else. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days following my mother and Nancy's demands felt surreal. It was as if a switch had flipped in my brain. Every suppressed frustration, every overlooked insult, and every moment of feeling like an outsider in my own family came rushing back at once. I wasn't just angry. I was done. Nancy, of course, didn't take my refusal well. She had never been told no before, at least not in a way that actually mattered. And now, when I denied her the penthouse she believed she was entitled to, she acted like I had personally destroyed her life. The texts started pouring in. At first, they were passive-aggressive. "I just don't understand why you'd help Damon but not me. Are you punishing me for something?" Then, they became desperate. "I need this place. I can't live with Mom forever. You're ruining my future." And finally, they turned hostile. "You're a selfish, bitter person. You always have been. You just want to see me fail." I blocked her number. Then I blocked Mom's too. I needed space. I needed peace. But peace was the last thing I was going to get. The moment I cut off their contact, my mother went on a full-scale guilt-tripping campaign. She called every relative she could, spinning a story about how I had abandoned my family in their time of need. She conveniently left out the part where Nancy had demanded a luxury penthouse, like it was her birthright. Within days, I started receiving messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins. "Your mother is really upset. Can't you just help Nancy out a little? Family is everything." "Don't you think you're being too harsh?" "I know Nancy can be difficult, but she's still your sister." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because for every relative that tried to guilt me, there was another who had finally seen my mother and Nancy's manipulation for what it was. My uncle, the one who had taken over the family business after Dad passed, called me directly. "I heard what's going on," he said. "I told Nancy no when she asked me for money. And I told your mother that if she keeps this up, she's going to alienate the rest of the family." For the first time, I felt like someone in my family was actually in my corner. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, they did. One morning, I got an email from my bank. It was a fraud alert. Someone had attempted to withdraw a large sum from one of my accounts, an account that, until now, had been untouched. I immediately called the bank. They confirmed that someone had tried to access the funds using an authorization code that belonged to my mother. I felt the blood drain from my face. She had access because, years ago, when I first started working, I had added her name to my emergency contacts. I never removed it. I never thought I had to. I was wrong. My mother had tried to steal from me. I closed the account that same day. I locked everything down, changing passwords, removing any possible access she might have had. But the damage was done. Not to my finances, but to something far worse. Whatever small, fragile thread of trust I still had left in her had snapped completely. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask her why she did it. I already knew. She was so desperate to keep Nancy's life afloat that she was willing to destroy mine in the process. That was the moment I realized that there was no saving our relationship. Days later, my mother showed up at my apartment. I had barely opened the door before she pushed past me, stepping inside like she owned the place. "We need to talk," she said, her tone sharp. I folded my arms. "About what? How did you try to steal from me?" Her face went pale. "It wasn't like that. You just what? Thought the first wouldn't notice? Thought I'd let it slide because family helps each other." My voice was shaking, but not from fear, from fury. You were willing to betray me for Nancy. You always have been, she scoffed. You're being dramatic. I raised you. I sacrificed for you. And this is how you repay me? By turning your back on your own family? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I was never part of this family, was I? Not really. Not in the way Nancy is. You made that clear a long time ago. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand. I'm done. With you. With Nancy. With all of it. You can tell whatever story you want to the rest of the family, but I know the truth now, and I'm not coming back. For a moment, she just stood there, stunned. Then her expression hardened. You'll regret this, she hissed. One day, when you're alone and no one is there for you, you'll wish you had been a better daughter. I met her gaze, unflinching. No, Mom, I'll just be free. She left without another word, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I could finally breathe. In the following weeks, I started reclaiming my life. I focused on my upcoming wedding, on my job, on the people who actually cared about me. Damon and I grew even closer, finally free of the toxic weight that had hung over us for so long. As for Nancy and Mom, they kept spinning their stories, but fewer and fewer people believed them. Their influence was crumbling, and the more they realized they could no longer control me, the more desperate they became. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I had spent my whole life trying to earn love from people who only valued me when I was useful to them. Now I was finally choosing myself, and it felt damn good. Cutting off my mother and Nancy should have been the end of it. It should have brought me peace. But, of course, they weren't going to let me go without a fight. For the first few weeks, I ignored the calls, the texts, the endless emails filled with guilt-tripping nonsense about how family is forever and how I was breaking my mother's heart. But then, the messages started coming from unknown numbers, random social media accounts. Even old friends I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly reaching out, saying my mother had contacted them, telling them I had lost my mind and needed to be talked some sense into. It was relentless, and it made me furious. I responded just once to one of my aunts who texted me with a half-hearted, "Can't you just let this go?" I laid it out for her. In brutal, undeniable detail, she tried to steal from me. Nancy thinks she's entitled to my money. They don't care about me. They never did. I'm done. And if you can't respect that, you can be done, too. She never replied, and slowly, the flood of messages started to die down. But the silence didn't bring peace. One day, an official-looking envelope arrived at my door. At first, I thought it was junk mail. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. Nancy was suing me. She had the audacity to claim that I had promised to financially support her, and that my refusal to do so had caused her undue hardship. She demanded damages for emotional distress, for lost opportunities, and of course, money to help her secure the lifestyle she deserved. It was laughable. And yet, I felt my hands tremble as I read it, because it wasn't just a ridiculous lawsuit. It was proof. Proof that Nancy truly believed she was entitled to my life, my success, my money. I called my lawyer immediately. He laughed. This won't hold up in court, but we'll respond officially. Let her waste her time and money. And waste it? She did. The case never even made it to a hearing. It was dismissed almost immediately, and Nancy was slapped with legal fees she definitely couldn't afford. But instead of backing down, she did something even worse. She went to the media. One morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with notifications. Nancy had gone online, posting a dramatic sob story about how her evil, greedy sister had abandoned her destitute family. She painted herself as the struggling, helpless younger sister, left behind while I supposedly hoarded my wealth and let them suffer. She even included an old childhood photo of us, making it seem like we had once been so close before I changed. And it worked. Strangers complete strangers began flooding my social media. People are calling me a monster, a selfish, heartless person who let her baby sister suffer. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not frustration, but exhaustion. I had spent my whole life fighting to be seen, to be treated as an equal in my own family. And even now, after cutting them off, after proving their manipulation, after protecting myself, I was still the villain in their story. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight back. But instead, I took a deep breath, logged off, and let it burn itself out. Because here's the thing about lies, they don't last. A few weeks later, I got a call from Damon. Mom's in trouble. I sighed. What now? She tried to take out a loan, using the company shares as collateral. Uncle found out. He stopped her just in time. But she's desperate. She's losing everything. A part of me wanted to feel something. Maybe pity, maybe sadness, but I felt nothing. I'm not getting involved, I said. Not anymore, Damon hesitated. I know, and I'm not asking you to. I wanted you to know. It's over. Mom's finally facing the consequences. And Nancy, well, she's spiraling. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. Good, he chuckled softly. Yeah, good. And with that, I knew. I had won. My wedding was coming up, a day that should have been filled with nothing but joy and love. And for the first time, I didn't have to worry about my mother or Nancy ruining it. Because they weren't invited. Because they were no longer part of my life. Because I had finally, truly broken free. And as I stood in front of the mirror, trying on my wedding dress, I smiled. Because for the first time in my life, I was happy. Cutting my mother and Nancy out of my life should have been the end of it. I wanted peace, to finally move on without the weight of their manipulation dragging me down. But, of course, they weren't going to let me go so easily. At first, the silence was unsettling. No phone calls, no messages, no unexpected appearances. For a brief moment, I thought they had finally accepted my decision. I should have known better. The first blow came from an unexpected source, my employer. One morning, I was called into HR for an urgent meeting. Confused, I walked in to find my boss sitting across from me with a stack of printed emails in his hand. We received these complaints about you, he said, sliding the papers toward me. They claim you've been engaging in unethical financial practices. Someone even alleged that you embezzled company funds. My stomach dropped. I scanned the emails, my pulse pounding in my ears. The sender was anonymous, but the language, the exaggerated accusations, the twisted half-truths, it was all too familiar. Nancy, or maybe even my mother. I clenched my fists. This was their revenge. They couldn't control me anymore, so they were trying to destroy me instead. I took a deep breath and met my boss's gaze. These accusations are completely false. We figured, he said, to my relief. Your track record speaks for itself, but we had to follow protocol. I nodded, forcing myself to remain calm. But inside, my blood was boiling. If they thought this would break me, they were dead wrong. If trying to sabotage my career wasn't enough, they went after my wedding next. Andrew and I had been carefully planning everything: guest lists, venue, catering, but suddenly, relatives who had previously confirmed started dropping out. My mother called. One cousin admitted. She told me she wouldn't forgive me if I attended. Another uncle sent me a text. I don't want to pick sides, but I can't upset your mother. I hope you understand. Understand? The first understood perfectly. My mother and Nancy were weaponizing guilt, trying to isolate me just like they always had. It was working on some, but not all. Damon was furious. This is low, even for them. Let them play their games, I said, though my heart ached. I don't need people who are that easily manipulated at my wedding. But that wasn't the end of it. A week later, Nancy showed up at Andrew's workplace. Nancy must have thought Andrew was an easier target. Maybe she assumed he'd take pity on her, that she could charm or guilt him into convincing me to cave. She was wrong. She waited outside his office building and intercepted him during lunch. According to Andrew, she started with crocodile tears, claiming she just wanted to make peace. I don't understand why she's punishing Mom and me, she whined. We're family. Families work things out. Andrew wasn't buying it. You tried to ruin her career. You turned the family against her. What exactly have you done to make things right? Nancy hesitated, but then her true nature came out. She owes me, she snapped. She had everything handed to her dad's money, her job, her perfect little life. And what did I get? Nothing. She should be helping me, not throwing me away like trash. Andrew later told me he had never seen someone so bitter, so consumed by entitlement. He simply shook his head and walked away, leaving her standing there, seething. When he got home, he took my hands in his and said, I don't want her at our wedding. Not even as a guest. I nodded. She was never invited. Nancy had made her bed. Now she could lie in it. The night before my wedding, I received one last email from my mother. You will regret this one day. You think you've won, but family isn't something you can just erase. I won't be there tomorrow, and neither will Nancy. When you come crawling back, don't expect forgiveness. I read it twice, then deleted it without responding. I wasn't crawling back. I was walking forward. And for the first time in my life, I was free. For the first time in my life, I felt untethered, free. No longer weighed down by the toxic expectations of a mother who saw me as a resource, and a sister who had never viewed me as anything but an obstacle in her endless pursuit of privilege. The days following my final confrontation with my mother were eerily quiet. No phone calls, no emails, no guilt-ridden messages from distant relatives attempting to manipulate me into reconsidering my decision. It was as though I had truly been cut off, just as she had promised. But instead of feeling abandoned, I felt liberated. I focused on what mattered: my career, my future, my wedding. Damon and I became closer than ever, our bond strengthening without the weight of our family's dysfunction pressing down on us. He'd always been my only true ally, and now, without the interference of our mother and Nancy, we could finally exist, without the ever-present tension of walking on eggshells. But just as I began to settle into this new sense of peace, a storm began brewing in the distance, one I hadn't seen coming. It started with a message from my uncle, the one who had taken over the family business after my father passed. He never involved himself in family drama, but this time, his tone was urgent. "I thought you should know," he wrote. "Your mother and Nancy are in serious trouble." I stared at the screen, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and exhaustion. Trouble? I should have expected it. Their world had always been built on illusion, on my mother's ability to bend reality to suit Nancy's needs. But illusions don't last forever. According to my uncle, Nancy had racked up an enormous amount of debt. Her extravagant lifestyle, supported by my mother's blind devotion, had finally caught up to her. And with my mother no longer able to manipulate others into bailing her out, the consequences were piling up fast. Worse yet, my mother had leveraged part of her remaining assets, including what was left of my father's inheritance, to cover Nancy's reckless spending. Now, she was on the verge of losing her home, the one thing she had always held over my head as proof of her superiority. And as if that wasn't enough, Nancy had apparently attempted to fraudulently secure a loan in my name. My uncle had caught wind of it before it could go through, immediately alerting the necessary authorities. "She's desperate," he told me. "I wouldn't be surprised if she tries something even worse." I should have been furious. I should have wanted revenge, but instead I felt nothing. Just a cold sense of finality. A confirmation that I had made the right decision in walking away. A week later, she showed up at my door. Nancy, disheveled, eyes puffy from what I could only assume was hours of crying. She wasn't dressed in her usual designer clothes. Her nails, always perfectly manicured, were chipped. She looked ordinary, vulnerable. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She tried to push past me, but I stood firm. "What do you want, Nancy?" She let out a breath, shaking her head. "I just need to talk to you. Please." I didn't invite her in. Instead, I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "Make it quick." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I messed up," she whispered. "I know I did. I know I've been awful to you. But I'm drowning, and I have no one left." I stayed silent, waiting. She swallowed hard. "Mom, she's losing everything, and I don't have anywhere to go. I need help." I exhaled slowly, already knowing where this was headed. "Nancy, the first spent my whole life watching you take and take, while I was told to survive on my own. And now, when the world finally isn't bending to your will, you come to me?" Her lips trembled. "I have nothing." I stared at her, the sister who had spent years tearing me down, belittling me, treating me as if I was beneath her. And for the first time, I saw her for what she truly was: broken. Not the untouchable golden child, but a woman who had never learned how to stand on her own 2 feet, because she never had to. But that wasn't my burden to carry. I stepped back. "I hope you figure it out," I said, "but I'm not your safety net. Not anymore." She opened her mouth, as if to argue, but then she saw it in my eyes. I was done. She nodded once, stepping back. Then, without another word, she walked away. That was the last time I saw Nancy. My mother, from what I heard, tried to reach out again a few months later, but I ignored it. Whatever mess she and Nancy had created for themselves, they would have to clean up without me. As for me, I finally got married, surrounded by people who truly loved and supported me. Damon stood by my side as my biggest supporter, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely, undeniably happy. It took years to break free, years to undo the damage of a childhood spent begging for love I was never going to receive. But I did it, and now I was living the life I had always deserved, without them, without guilt, without regret, just peace, and that was enough.